Hi, namaste, and welcome to the program. Before I start today's program, which will be an investigation of something called the Scole experiment, for those of you who don't know, the Scole experiment was an investigation into the paranormal. Allegedly, two mediums and two of their friends set up a type of laboratory, a spiritual laboratory, in a basement. It was blacked out, and there allegedly creatures from another world came in, jinn, ancestors, you can call it what you want. But before we investigate this, I think we should look at the power of the mind, our belief system, and more importantly, the business of spirituality. From the earliest times, human beings have attributed parts of their lives to forces outside of themselves. These forces can be described as spirits, ancestors, angels, jinn, or unseen intelligences. Ever since humanity began recording anything permanently, those records have been reflected, and they've reflected a recurring assumption that reality extends beyond the immediate visible world. Evidence of an outside force is neither simple or uniform. If we go back to the prehistoric times, cave paintings often include hand stencils. These are sometimes described as disembodied hands, which implies a contact with another realm. Unfortunately, because we only have the hands, we don't really have any interpretation to prove that the hands mean this. These markings could just as easily represent ritual identity, social belonging, or some kind of symbolic presence. However, one fact remains across cultures and eras. The same behavioural pattern appears throughout the world. What we can safely say, in general, people act as though there is something beyond the self that does respond. Where does this leave our train of thought? Well, to understand something, you have to understand its origin. The modern spiritualist movement is often traced back to there were three of them, I believe, the Fox sisters in mid-19th century America. Their seances were popularized spiritual communication. It was brought into the public consciousness through alleged rapping that answered questions. Crucially, we have to understand that at first they were not exposed by skeptics and people went along with it. However, a person, he was probably a modern psychologist called Charles Grafton Page, examined the Fox sisters phenomenon empirically. He observed their posture, their muscle tension, and their body mechanics during the alleged sittings. He noticed that the rapping sounds consistently coincided with specific physical positions of the girls and involuntary joint movements. His conclusion was, ironically, they weren't faking. It was their subconscious doing the work, if you like. His exposure was calm, and it was cooperative, and it was clinical, but it demonstrated something much more unsettling, that fakery can occur even out of the conscious mind of the person operating the hoax. And I've seen this many times myself. I've been to seances, and it's amazing how people will get behind this phenomena when it's pretty obvious that it's actually not supernatural. I'm not suggesting the people are deliberately faking it, but I think people can get caught up in the emotion. Since we're talking about fakes, we have to bring into focus something that I actually found quite distressing. One of my favourite occult writers is Helena Blavatsky. Now, she was a strange fish. She publicly dismissed spiritualism. She said it was crude, she said it was intellectually shallow. She argued that the seance phenomena was just spirit-wrapping nonsense. However, at the same time, she had her own spiritualist phenomena, or seance, or whatever you want to call it. However, she claimed hers were higher because they had access to the ancient masters and authentic intelligences. Her performance included letters coming into locked rooms and messages transmitted from these non-physical masters. However, later demonstrations found that these effects relied on concealed mechanism and wires. And to me, I found that quite sad, because somebody who was as important as Blavatsky could actually fake a phenomena. The fact she was faking spiritualism obviously then reflects very badly on her work. How much of that was hoax? I've read a lot of Blavatsky, and I think a lot of it is incredibly genuine, but I don't think we can hop away lightly from the fact that a great deal of the money she made was through trickery. I want to take the Blavatsky phenomena into a much more important level. I don't think we can really sort of hover too much around this deceptiveness, because in reality it recurs quite often with a lot of so-called spiritualists. They publicly reject one type of belief while they monetize their own belief. And it's usually a much more elaborate version of the same. This is not an anomaly, it's just literally a business model. And I think this is the problem with all these so-called psychics. They're not opposing belief, they're just competing for authority. And this context matters. It shows that spiritual environments can have the most sincere belief, but harbour a very dark, unconscious self-deception, which includes deliberate manipulation. But we cannot forget that all this deception and deliberate manipulation is commercial incentive. These are not mutually exclusive categories for just spiritualism, but you will find it within a lot of occult phenomena, a lot of meditation groups, a lot of so-called our religion is bigger than yours. So this brings us to another phenomena, which of course is the power of the mind. The power of the mind is a very difficult thing to confrontate, because everybody has the idea and even the experience that thoughts influence reality. This is not a new thing. There is the word abracadabra, which literally translates to I speak, therefore I create. The power of the mind is a very difficult thing to confrontate, because everybody has the idea and even the experience that thoughts influence reality. This is not a new thing. There is the word abracadabra, which literally translates to I speak, therefore I create. This predates modern psychology, religion, science. And what does it tell us? Does it tell us that there is some kind of subconscious understanding, or is it we understand that focus alters behaviour and belief affects persistent? Mental framing changes how opportunities are perceived and how risk is tolerated. And this brings us to tools such as affirmations, visualization, prayers, and even wish boards. They operate primarily through the subconscious. They prime the attention and then they reinforce identity. Used carefully, they can be affected. But there's a limit, and that limit is often what modern spirituality refuses to acknowledge. Look, let me explain. You can have Ferraris all over your wall. You can have manifestations in your mind that you want a Ferrari, but if that was the case, then everybody I know would be driving a Ferrari. So the subconscious does not create capacity. It amplifies what already exists. I'm not saying that mental techniques cannot enhance skills. They can. However, they cannot replace skill. It doesn't matter how much you think that you are Magnus Carlsen and you do your affirmation and you do your board. At the end of the day, if you haven't trained like Magnus Carlsen, you're not going to be anything like him as a chess player. However, mental techniques can encourage you to take action, but they become dangerous when they ask you to suspend reality. Having the correct mental technique can support ambition, but it's not going to override market forces or geography or timing or competence. These mistakes are made quite often, believing the mind has power. But the mistake is believing the mind is sufficient. We have to understand that we have to go beyond just thinking something. You have to have the skill to do it. Now, this is a real warning point to anybody who is a occultist, because if you speak out against this and say, no, you still need skill, it's not all mental, you should rely on the spirits, then that's interpreted as negative. Where realistically, if you look at African tribes, if you look at people who dedicate themselves to spirituality, for example, even in the Western world, boxers, if you look at the top boxers, they're amazingly religious. In all honesty, if I was a boxer, I think I would be religious as well. But they definitely put their faith in something which is higher than them. And I think that this stops failure becoming moralized and stops them having incorrect beliefs rather than faulty assumptions. Because it can, if you like, keep them humble, and it can keep them listening to feedback. Whereas if you just say to yourself, oh, God is with me, I'm indestructible. I mean, this was also demonstrated between Fury and not Usyk, his other opponent, I forget his name. He was a black guy. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, but the black guy said that he had a god inside of him and he was indestructible. And Fury said, well, I'm a Christian, I don't believe in your God. And the guy lost. And I think that that's really important, because one would presume that if the guy truly had a God inside of him, then he wouldn't have lost. This is the idea. If the God is inside of you, it's supposed to make you indestructible. But the interesting thing is that mind work and spiritual work, it's a little bit like alcohol. Too little has no effect. A moderate amount can loosen ambition and improve confidence. Too much leads to intoxication, loss of judgment, the wrong decision. So I think you have to understand that sort of like, to effectively use spiritual or mentally techniques, there is a narrow band. And outside of that narrow band, it will actually impair on you. So, in all honesty, reality is the constant restraint. I think that if you go beyond reality, I'm not saying it can't work, but I've seen many people waste their lives just going beyond what they can ordinarily do. So, once the outside belief becomes a liability, you're no longer practicing spiritualism, and you're no longer practicing any form of psychology. You're in a kind of a wish world. And as the old saying said, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride. So we understand the mechanics of belief. Unfortunately, if you're in occultism, if you're in kind of any sort of spiritual belief system, you want that system to work. And this is why well-presented, spiritually slick shows should raise suspicion, because you know yourself that spirituality doesn't work like that. So the more polished the presentation, the more controlled the narrative, the less room there is for anything disruptive to occur. Real spiritual insight and mind phenomena is usually inconvenient, and it really doesn't scale to sort of TV very well. It doesn't package well because it's very difficult to reproduce. However, on the other hand, a business model requires consistency, reassurance, emotional payoff, and authority. And the sad fact is, once spirituality becomes a repeatable product, truth becomes secondary by necessity. This is not trying to insult anybody. This is just pointing out the obvious. This is just an economic reality. So the question is whether or not there is spiritual or mind power. It's whether anything real can survive being sold in a commercial way. And that I very much doubt, because spirituality is a lot more disciplined. It's a lot less predictable. And I think that this is the question that I'm going to be looking at when we actually examine the Scole's material. We're not looking for, if you like, deliberate fraud. I seriously want it, to be true. But if it's slick, predictably smooth, and you can guarantee the outcomes, I would see that as a red flag. Thank you very much for listening, and namaste.